Hi, I'm Bridger Fates, and welcome to Master Stockman's Sheep Management Videos. We're going to do 8 of these videos, cover some topics that should be interesting to all of you, whether you're managing a small farm flock or whether you've got a large range flock like this that we're out here with today. I think you'll find these videos interesting. We've got a good team. Whit Stewart, Dr. Whit Stewart is our sheep specialist, and he's going to cover a lot of ground in these videos. We've also got myself, Bridger Fates. I'll be covering the economics. Bart and Stan will be hitting on the range management topics, and Hudson Hill will be covering a lot of sheep topics as well as focusing on risk management. So that's the team. We hope to do these videos in a little bit more interactive format instead of just a lecture format. So you're going to see some live action like this, you're going to see some lecture, and then you're going to see some roundtable discussion between all of us. So if that's interesting to you, stick around. We've got some great videos on tap for you.
The American Sheep Industry Association, in conjunction with the Livestock Marketing Information Center, conducted a sheep industry cost of production study, which was largely based upon various regions. The table below shows some of those major component costs on an annual basis for a ewe. A major component of these costs are those related to feed production and grazing. As part of this cost of production study, based on Livestock Marketing Information Center figures, a comparison from 2010 to 2015 shows the competitiveness of a sheep enterprise on a sheep-adjusted animal unit month basis. You can see some of the complementary effects when comparing the cattle column to the sheep AUM adjusted column and looking at the standard market volatility over the course of a period of 5 years it might occur, and one can see some of the complementarity that exists across these two enterprises. The complementarity of multi-species grazing and enterprise stacking with sheep largely revolves around the ability to differentiate in their dietary selection. Sheep's flexibility and dietary flexibility in terms of preference for broadleaf plants versus grass allows them to show adaptation when certain forage resources are available. They have a broad degree of dietary overlap and are highly adaptable to what forage is often available across seasons. When given a chance, they can switch to broadleaf forbs in summer over grass. Maximizing this grazing resource is illustrated here in this extension publication from Derek Scasser from the University of Wyoming. It shows the broad differences that exist in terms of the grass preference of beef cattle at approximately 74% of their diet, compared to a more versatile grazing diet with domestic sheep. In a 1994 review by Dr. John Walker, he averaged the benefits of multi-species grazing cattle with sheep across different production systems, and on average observed a 24% increase in sheep production when co-grazing occurred with cattle, and a 9% increase in cattle production when co-grazing with sheep. Specifically, one of the benefits of multi-species grazing cattle and sheep is the resultant increase in grazing days when sheep followed cattle in a grazing system. Research has shown that lamb production per acre when grazed with cattle and wool production per acre when grazed with cattle has resulted in economic benefit to an enterprise. Cows will clean up tall mature forage while sheep will select those broadleaf plants in a grazing system and those vegetative parts that oftentimes cattle may ignore. Sheep will clean up around cow patties more than cattle alone. Cows can also help manage the barber pole worm when grazing pastures that have been grazed by sheep prior and serve as a dead end. Some additional management considerations when adding a sheep enterprise to an existing cattle enterprise will be water infrastructure needs, principally making sure that the water is accessible to the sheep. Also, understanding that some of those nutritional differences, especially when it comes to mineral supplementation, exist. For example, sheep cannot consume cow mineral due to the increased copper that is put into a cow mineral. Oftentimes, this can be overcome in the mineral apparatus, the mineral feeder that is provided, but making sure that sheep, due to their relatively low threshold for copper toxicity, that they're not consuming a cow mineral is one very specific nuance when adding a sheep enterprise to an existing cattle enterprise. Your infrastructure and what will be required, whether it be fence, watering systems, nutritional management, will vary by location and the interest in adding that additional enterprise. Understanding that the fencing infrastructure that's required oftentimes is an important consideration when adding a sheep enterprise. The extent to which a fencing system needs to be incorporated will depend on the available resources, but priority and quality should be given to a perimeter fence, in most cases to keep the sheep in, and to a lesser extent, no matter how hard we try, it's difficult to keep predators out. But a woven wire fence on the perimeter would be a gold standard.
Well, let's say that you're interested in adding some sheep to your cattle operation. Certainly Whit talked about some of those advantages. And there are advantages and studies that show that you can, even add up to 1 ewe per cow without really changing the carrying capacity of your operation. So say you had a 500 cow operation and you wanted to add 500 ewes to that operation. How would you go about deciding whether that might be a good investment? Well, first off, there's some things you got to think about in terms of your own knowledge base and skill base and some of those issues that you need to think about. But from an economics perspective, how would you go about that? So in this example, we're going to use the partial budget tool from the Wyoming Ranch Tools first to go through, and we're going to consider adding 500 ewes to our cattle operation. So I sat down and tried to go through my numbers as best I could on 500 ewes and figured on pasture and feed, I'd have about $24 per ewe expense on that. On salt and mineral, about $2 per ewe. Vet, I put in there at $2.75 per ewe. Hauling, other equipment expenses, I had it in there at $13.25. Shearing, $6.25 per ewe. Predator control, dog food, those general categories, $2.10 per ewe. In terms of family labor and hiring a labor, I put this in with an H2A worker that I'm going to need to add to my operation for this at $16 per ewe. Camp supplies, going to have to add a camp and supply that. I put that in at $4.50 per ewe. And then other expenses that I tried to account for, I'm somewhere around $14. So my total expenses are $42,425 by adding these ewes in as best as I could estimate, on my operation as we're going through this example. Certainly you want to try and go through this and be as accurate as you can in terms of building this model for your own operation if you're making this decision. Then I went over and I said, well, if I can sell ewe lambs and wether lambs, that's something new. That's an additional income. So I've sold those at 80 pounds and 85 pounds, selling fewer ewe lambs because I'm retaining those ewe lambs to replace my ewes that I'm culling. But I accounted for my culls and wool, all income sources that I can account for. And based on that, I had an additional income of $66,610. So on an annual basis, these were kind of the additional costs I could think of on my operation and the additional income. I couldn't really think of any reduced income based on this change, and I couldn't really think of any reduced cost on my own operation based on this change. But if you can think of those, certainly add those in to your specific operation. So with this, I've got an estimate of a net income of $24,185 per year. That's a net annual income. So this isn't the end of the story, though. It's going to take some serious investment to buy these ewes. You're going to have to buy other supplies in terms of, I have to buy my camp. I've got to buy some rams to get started. So rams to get started, ewes to get started, camp to get started. Probably got to get some other fencing and some temporary fencing. So I'm going to have some significant costs into this to get started. So how do you know whether you can pay off that investment? Even though you're estimating that you're going to increase your revenue by 24,000, how do you know that you're going to pay off that investment? Now, one big plus here is we're assuming that our fixed costs like buildings and depreciation on the ranch and all of those things aren't changing because we're just adding these ewes in without changing the ranch size or scaling up our ranch. So, we have that advantage, but still, can we afford to make this investment if we're only going to be adding $24,000 in net revenue a year on our operation? So the tool that you would use to do that is the net present value tool on the Wyoming Ranch Tools site. And if we had an initial investment of 150,000. So that's assuming that it's going to cost us about 100,000 to buy those 500 ewes, as well as then cost of rams, cost of camp, and other startup costs. So I estimated an initial investment of 150,000. And if we want a 5% return on our investment, we can enter that in there as that interest rate. Then we enter those annual costs and returns from that partial budget we just did. So a reminder, over here is where we get those numbers. Here's our total annual cost of 42,425 and our total annual return of 66,610. So going back to the net present value tool, we enter those in 42,425, 66,610. And based on that initial investment of 150,000, after 5 years, we're still losing money. We're still losing about $40,000. It takes 8 years to break even on this investment. And after 10 years, we'd see a $46,000 return on our investment. So that's the strategy we would take. So if you're interested in adding sheep to your operation and you go through these calculations, break it even year of 8 years, that might be too far out for you. You might not be interested in it. But if it might be something that you are interested in, and certainly after 10 years, we're seeing a pretty positive return. So that's the way that you would look at this. You have to do both. You have to go through that partial budget to see your costs and returns that are changing. And then you have to analyze this time value of money, right? Money is, because of interest and opportunity costs, it's not worth the same to us today as it is tomorrow. And so that's what this analysis does. It calculates a return on your investment of that 150,000. So I know it's a bit of a challenge, but thinking through the process of adding sheep to your cattle operation is a challenge to understand from an economics perspective. But you can use these two calculators to really get at whether that makes sense for you on your operation or not. Again, we're not trying to convince you that you need to do this. Certainly some of you will not have the skill set to add sheep to your cattle operation. Some of you may, and if you do, run these economics and see if it makes sense for you. So with that, let's change over to the panel discussion and see what the panel has to say about adding sheep to a cattle operation. All right, so we're here talking about, possibly adding some sheep to a cattle operation and what that might look like. So Barton, I know that there's information in the literature and producers have talked about it over the years that you can add sheep to your cattle operation without really decreasing the overall carrying capacity of your property. Is that true on all property types? Is that true on all range types? What are some key factors to look at there?
Sure. Well, it's definitely going to depend on the ranch or the range that you're running on. But absolutely, most properties could add sheep to a cow-calf or even a yearling operation without necessarily overgrazing. With the sheep being able to utilize different topography, they have probably a more varied diet than cows do. Their mouth parts are also different, so they're much more nimble when they're feeding on say, shrubs. They're able to get in there and get the small green or herbaceous parts, the highly nutritious parts of the plants that they're going after. And so it really is a technique for adding capacity to your ranch without taking away or overgrazing by adding sheep to a cattle operation.
Does it make any difference if you're out on a range site like this versus in an irrigated pasture in terms of that forage selection?
Well, it'll depend a little bit because typically in an irrigated pasture situation you have a much more uniform, probably less varied plants that are out there, where if you get out into a more rangeland type setting, you've got a bigger variety of plants. So there will be a little bit of advantages, maybe some more advantage if you're talking about being up in a rangeland environment, especially with the topography. When the topography comes in, you'll get places where cows just won't go even if there's not feed, or they won't readily go. And those are areas that sheep can thrive in. Steep slopes, rocky terrain.
And they're highly flexible. That's what I think is a real merit to sheep production in a cattle enterprise, is if you have an abundance of perhaps even invasive broadleaf plants encroaching on your pasture, those sheep can actually help manage that underutilized resource versus spraying or mechanically controlling it. And I just think that dietary flexibility allows us to, when we are in the winter months, and sheep will use browse species more, and we've done research that shows the crude protein content of these shrubs is a real lifesaver in a range environment where everything else, the grass, is lower quality. So I mean, a resource efficient animal, when run right in a cattle enterprise, like, it can work.
That's a great point you brought up about sheep being able to utilize certain species. You know, I worked with a ranch that they were spraying a noxious weed for the longest time, and they said we could never get ahead of the noxious weeds with spray, but once we turned sheep in there, we were able to not only take care of the weeds, but make a profit off the weeds.
I think excuse me, Bridger, I think when we're talking about adding sheep to an enterprise, though, I think there's a lot more to think about than just the best way to utilize our resources, right? I think it was William Shakespeare that said there's no profit made where there's no pleasure taken, and there's a lot of people and in a lot of situations where sheep wouldn't make them happier. There's a lot of cattle, you know, there's a lot of places where people don't like cattle, so I think there's more to take into that than just resources, right?
Absolutely. So fencing, water infrastructure, those are real investments that would need to be made. But I like what you said, Hudson. I think if you want an enterprise to be successful, you will implement the strategies and the necessary resources to make it work. I think if we go into adding a sheep enterprise half-hearted, unwilling to take a year to kind of understand those nuances that exist, then we may be disappointed adding a sheep enterprise. And so I think it's the same principle with guard dogs, right? I mean, guard dogs are another management tool that can add value to our operation, but if we don't like stock dogs on our operation, they're never going to be successful in our system.
Yeah, it adds a level of management. And I think that the final key to that, really, Bridger, is exactly economically how might that affect us adding a whole nother income stream to our operation.
Yeah, I mean, that's a good question. We talked about that a little bit earlier in the slides, but, you know, really it can really help sort of level out that income flow. And, you know, it's a great cash flow management strategy. You know, a lot of times when you look at our markets, cattle will be high in one year and sheep high in different years. And it's fairly rare, actually, that they're both high or both low in the same years. So it's really a way to sort of manage that cash flow. You know, and sheep add another enterprise in terms of the wool, and wool markets also vary differently at different times than the lamb market or the cattle market. And so really it's a way to spread out those income sources and spread out the timing so that reduces those negative years on your operation, which, you know, for a lot of ranchers, those negative years are the hard thing to make it through. So I think it's, from an economics perspective, can be a real strong strategy for producers. Yeah, I mean, the only other question I have for Whit is, you know, so if you're a cattle rancher and you're a good rancher and you know your cattle, does that make you a good sheep man as well, or are there some tricks of the trade that you're really going to have to pick up before adding sheep to your operation?
Absolutely. I think there's a couple of things. I think that the twin bearing potential of sheep requires some different nutritional paradigms when managing sheep production systems. They could be as intensive as you want or extensive as you want. And I think breed selection, right? Do you want to deal with shearing? Are you going to prepare that wool and handle that wool so it is a highly marketable clip? Or do you want a lower input sheep breed like hair sheep? I think those are some good preliminary questions to ask. And I think the animal health considerations are pretty similar, but I think one of the greatest merits of sheep production is, without even trying, we will have multiple bearing ewes. There will be twins and triplets in our flock. Sometimes the triplets are less helpful in a management system, but when you can raise 115 to 180% lamb crop on limited resources, it adds some value, I think, and some enterprise value to have that multiple bearing aspect of sheep.
Yeah, I think, and something as simple as herding, right? I mean, sometimes you hear cattle guys complain about herding sheep, but really herding sheep's just as simple as herding cattle. It's just different strategies, and until you learn those strategies and think about different ways to go about it, you're probably going to have some frustrations switching back and forth. So we'd like to thank USDA Risk Management Agency for partially funding these videos. We'd like to thank you guys for watching the videos. please be sure to like and subscribe to this channel and the videos. Really helps us out in terms of future planning. You know, if you can comment down below how you might use some of these tools or what you've learned from these videos, that'd be really helpful. And also if you could comment down below on some future topics that you'd like to see us cover. With that, I guess that's the end of this video, and we'll see you on the other videos. Thanks for watching.